J'ai la lourde tâche de présider la dernière table ronde en fin de journée après une journée dense et extrêmement riche. La première intervention sera celle de Ursula Estrada, qui nous vient du Mexique. Donc voilà, ça montre bien l'ouverture extrêmement large de ce colloque. Ursula Estrada est doctorante en histoire de l'art à l'Université autonome nationale de Mexico. Elle a déjà publié de nombreux travaux, notamment, je pense que c'est un ouvrage, Pre-Hispanic Cities, Mexico Pre-Hispanic and Viceroyal Cities, et aussi plusieurs articles qui tournent autour de cette question de l'histoire de l'art. Et elle va nous parler plus précisément ici de la professionnalisation de femmes artistes et de leur participation aux expositions universelles. Donc je vous laisse la parole pour 20 minutes, puis ensuite nous aurons 20 minutes de l'intervention d'Anne Epstein, et ensuite nous aurons 20 minutes de questions. I'm not sure. Okay.
My paper is part of my PhD research. It is work in progress, so I'm going to present my what I've advanced so far. I've tried to make a bilingual presentation. I hope my French is correct. If not, I apologize in advance. When the Women's Building was inaugurated in the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in May 1st, 1893, the first regular women students had been attending Mexico's National School of Fine Arts for 5 years. In 1888, 4 women were admitted into the landscape painting class, taught at the time by José María Velasco, a renowned artist whose landscapes had become a symbol of national identity. Their names were Dolores Soto, Charlotte Camacho, Josephine Rees, and Carmen Lopez. All of them exhibited paintings in the Women's Building and were among the most outstanding women students of the school. They had received several prizes in the annual awards granted by the Academy and had also received some recognition from art criticism during the 22nd exhibition of the Academy, which took place in 1891. This is a photograph of them with Professor Velasco. The photograph has not been dated. It might be close to 1889. And so these are some of the students who hadn't been identified yet, unfortunately. These students were not the first Mexican women artists whose work was shown at a universal exposition. Some had already participated in the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1867 and in the New Orleans World Exposition in 1885, as well as in the Universal Exhibition held in Paris in 1889, which is being studied by Angelica Velázquez Guadarrama, which is here among us. She's a professor of the Aesthetics Research Institute in the Autonomous University of Mexico. Bertha Palmer, president of the Board of Lady Managers of the Women's Building, gave an inaugural speech during the opening ceremonies in which she argued in favor of training and higher education for women, stating that they were necessary for the betterment of their economic and living conditions, as well as that of their families. Wanda Korn has called attention to how the new ideals of womanhood promoted by the Board of Lady Managers were symbolically constructed through the art embedded in the architecture of the Women's Building. One of the allegories created for this purpose was the new girl student, or schoolgirl, as Korn names her, whose attributes were an open book on her knee, an open book on her knee, a pen in her hand, a mortar board on her head, and a globe of the world behind her. Korn has also pointed out the limitations to represent and to carry out these new ideals in everyday life. When analyzing the matronly figure with a child represented in Rosa Emmett Sherwood's The Republic's Welcome to Her Daughters, the author reflects on its ambiguities in relation to the future that an educated woman could have in the late 19th century. Oops, sorry. Right here. Sherwood's new girl has grown up to be a self-possessed mother, grandmother, and woman reformer responding to her maternal instinct. Sorry, this is a quote. I'll begin again. Sherwood's new girl has grown up to be a self-possessed mother, grandmother and woman reformer responding to her maternal instincts and looking after the needs of the young. If Sherwood wanted to show that modern woman could simultaneously be mother, artist, and philanthropist, she did not do so with much clarity. Sherwood's ambivalent speech in configuring a new woman is significant, not as a fault, but as an indication of the limits to what middle and upper-class American women could imagine saying in public about the progress of her sex. These works heralded the coming generation's move out of the home into school and studio, but they could not envision women practicing professional careers either alongside or separate from motherhood. The Academy women students would also face similar challenges. Some of them would eventually earn a living through jobs related to the arts, favoring their professional careers and remaining unmarried, while others found ways to attend both work and family. Others did not develop a professional career, often because they were called to attend their duties as wives and mothers. The participation of the Mexican women in the Columbine Exposition was organized by the Auxiliary of Ladies, which was created in August 1892. It was led by no other than President Porfirio Díaz's wife, Carmen Romero Rubio de Díaz. Like other politically important women of other nations, Carmen Romero was invited by Palmer herself. The wives of other politically and culturally relevant men were chosen as members of the auxiliary. The fine arts section was directed by two of them, Gertrudis Teruel de Schmidtlein, who was one of the only two Mexican artists who received awards in the exposition, and Concepcion Lascurain, wife of the director of the National School of Fine Arts, Roman Lascurain, who was also appointed chief of the Fine Arts section by the Mexican Commission for the Columbian Exposition. In Mexico, the press praised the abilities and enthusiasm of the Auxiliary of Ladies in the organization of the exhibit. The article, "The Mexican Woman in the Chicago Exposition," published in April 1893, ended with an optimistic conclusion. I quote, "The general elevation of woman in all of Mexico with a common aim, to exhibit her work in the arts and sciences, has a much greater importance than the simple exposition of the achievements of woman. It indicates that she is gaining worth and strength, and that the day is nearer in which she will be an important and better recognized factor of the great intellectual, material, and spiritual work of the world." In spite of this optimistic remark, no women were officially appointed by the Mexican government to be representatives in Chicago, nor to be a part of the women's jury. Two men, Ricardo de María y Campos and Manuel Huidobro de Azúa, were chosen as commissioners for the Women's Building. Since the works sent by the Auxiliary of Ladies were too many to be shown in the space destined for the Mexican exhibit, the choices of what was and was not to be shown relied on these officials. The exhibit of Mexico in the Women's Pavilion was inaugurated in June 20, 1893. Much attention was given to the beauty and craftsmanship of the works of embroidery and lacework made by Mexican women. Another highlight of their participation was an orchestra of young ladies who performed traditional music dressed in typical clothing. The orchestra was put together specifically to be shown in the fair by Margarita Kleinhans Wright, a music teacher who graduated from the National Conservatory, and only daughter of Loriana Wright, a prominent figure of journalism and feminism in Mexico, who argued in favor of education for women. The anthology Mexican Women Poets, this is a view of a presidential chair that was shown at the exhibition, which was also very much praised. And here is the anthology. Mexican Women Poets, commissioned by the Auxiliary of Ladies and edited by José María Vigil, also gained recognition. It comprised works from the 16th to the 19th centuries, including those of already renowned poets such as Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, as well as from contemporary women writers. A chronicle by Gonzalo de Quesada offered an account of the Mexican paintings shown in the Women's Building. This is a view of a section of the paintings from Mexico in the Women's Building. And I quote from the article, "A Columbine guard shows us the stairway we must take. To the sides we see unpretentious paintings, full of merit in their modesty, paintings about our matters that bear our signatures. The Watercolor by Mrs. de Arechega, The Landscape by Merced Gamaro, which might be this one right here. The Still Life by Eulalia Lucio de Hernandez, which could be that one, sorry, right there. The different paintings by Ladies Fuentes, Muris, Chambert, Soto, and Torres. The Joyful Interior of a House by Miss Malé Prevost. The Tio Cali by Mrs. Terwell de Schmidtlein. A Portrait of Herself by Mrs. Camacho. Some Pansies by Mrs. Rebull. The Head of a Virgin and the Beggar That Asks for Alms by Mrs. Yusandizaga. And The Young Early Rising Milk Boy by Mrs. Escalante, who comes alive among the tunas and the sand of the path. This one right there. In his account, Quesada mentions the work of two of the Academy students, Carlota Camacho, or Charlotte Camacho, and Dolores Soto. He tells us that Camacho sent a self-portrait, and according to the shipment list, Soto could have sent a flower study. I don't have a picture of them in the Chicago Women's Building. According to the official catalog of the exhibits of the Republic of Mexico, the other students, Ruiz and Lopez, exhibited one oil painting each, and Ezequiel Valdez a landscape. Unfortunately, the catalog did not include neither the titles nor the descriptions of their works. The fact that these women were students in the Academy seems to have been overlooked in Quesada's account. In the Mexican press, only one of them gained recognition as such, Camacho, whose work received considerable attention, was particularly identified as a student of José Salomé Pina, another renowned artist who taught the figure painting class. Camacho was the daughter of a Mexican diplomat, Carlos Camacho, and Charlotte Hall, who was English. Camacho was born in 1876 in Mexico. As a child, she and her family lived in the cities of Quito and Guayaquil in Ecuador and traveled to New York City. When the family settled down in Mexico City, Camacho attended a Catholic school for girls and began studying at the academy at a very young age. In 1891, Camacho's father passed away, after which she was granted a scholarship from the school to continue her studies. Camacho's work had begun gaining some attention from art critics since the 21st exhibition of the Academy in 1891, in which she received an award. The Academy also bought one of her paintings, a copy, The Peasant Girl, to be raffled among the exhibition's subscribers. In 1893, before her self-portrait was shown in Chicago, Camacho's painting began to gain attention from the press. A newspaper article published in April stated that, I quote, "Among the works that have been sent, 7 original paintings by the young artist Carlota Camacho are very much praised. Their composition and use of color are excellent," end of quote. Another note, published that same month in the journal Voz de México, or Voice of Mexico, was entirely dedicated to Camacho. It described 6 paintings sent to the exhibition, mostly still lives and landscapes, some of which had been previously shown in the 22nd exhibition of the Academy. Art professor José Vasconcelos himself was in charge of the arrangement of the fine and liberal arts exhibit in it, having conveniently placed in the having conveniently placed in the latter all of the paintings made by ladies that Mr. José María Velasco designated as worthy of being shown in the new place assigned to Mexico for this purpose. Vasconcelos chose to show Camacho's self-portrait, which the article mentioned above described as the great work of Miss Camacho. According to it, the artist had devised this composition with the intention of showing in Chicago a Mexican type. In it, she portrays herself as a woman dressed with a typical and colorful shawl and a richly embroidered jarano hat, holding a rifle in her hands. According to the note, she is standing before a legendary tree located in the neighborhood of Tacuba. It is not very clear. It is right here. You can see the trunk of the tree. She is standing before a legendary tree located in the neighborhood of Tacuba, which was believed to be the very same in which the conquistador Hernán Cortés cried his defeat before the Aztec army during the conquest. After describing the painting, the article abruptly ends with the phrase, "The painting is called The Huntress, and made no remarks about this self-constructed figure of a 17-year-old artist. This work poses many questions about its creation, its reception, and interpretation, perhaps not only to those who saw it in Chicago and in the 23rd exhibition of the Academy in 1898, in which it was also shown, but also to our contemporary gaze. The image holds much more similarities with the many photographs of women soldiers of the Mexican Revolution, rather than to other late 19th century portraits of women. Indeed, the two pieces of clothing that Camacho chose as icons of a typical Mexican, the jarano hat, which is now well known for being worn by the mariachi, and the colorful shawl did not begin to become icons of Mexican identity until the 1930s. At the time when Camacho painted the huntress, they did not have the same symbolic meanings they do now. What was much more common in academic painting at the time were representations of Mexico's history, particularly episodes from both pre-Hispanic history and mythology, as well as from the conquest, which became part of the Academy's iconographic program during the late 1860s. Genre scenes representing Mexico's contemporary ideas of typical Mexican citizens were also popularized, and Velasco's vast landscapes became a symbol of national identity. These historical and mythological episodes had also begun to be popularized through publications about ancient legends and biographies of historical characters. Most of the works of male Mexican artists shown in the Fine Arts Palace represented this kind of scenes. Two more works, which refer to Cortés's defeat and the Sad Night Tree, were exhibited in the Fine Arts Palace during the Chicago Fair. They were not historical scenes, but landscapes. One by Velasco himself, and another one by one of Camacho's first classmates, Cleofas Almanza. Velasco's Tree of the Sad Night was painted in 1885. It shows the remaining trunk of the legendary tree. Almanza's version of this landscape was shown in the 21st exhibition of the Academy in 1886, when he was a student of Velasco's class. The title of this work in the Chicago catalog emphasized its historical and legendary importance. The Tree of the Sad Night, Cortés the Conqueror wept under this tree. We know of this landscape by Almanza only through this exposition's catalogs, yet it is probable that its composition was similar to that of Velasco and, thus, that none of these landscapes showed a scene that directly represented the episode, but just suggested it through the title. It is probable that Camacho knew these paintings and might have been influenced by these subjects when choosing the setting for her portrait, which does not make a direct representation to the historical scene either. This painting still needs to be studied in depth, yet we may begin to think about similar representations of women in art history. Women holding weapons tend to be either allegories or goddesses. Perhaps the most familiar would be the French Marianne and its iconic representation as a well-known symbol of the Republic and of liberty. The title of Camacho's work, The Huntress, also suggests mythological references, such as that of goddess Artemis or Diana. In her analysis of the artwork in the Women's Building, Korn also called attention to the problems that women artists faced when creating new iconographies to represent the ideals of the new woman and of her story. I quote, "As Alice Rideout, the principal sculptor of the Women's Building, told a reporter, the most difficult task for her, and presumably for all the women artists, was the choice of subjects. Given the inherent sexism of the late 19th century allegorical vocabulary, if an artist like Rideout wanted women to be something more than Amazons, idealized beauties, or generic goddesses, she had to invent symbolic figures and stories in which women were active protagonists, shaping contemporary culture and managing their own desires. It could be possible that Camacho was also creating an image for herself and of a new womanhood through her self-portrait, negotiating between the artistic language that her academic education had taught her and the configuration of a new womanhood in Mexico, of which she was taking part. The participation of this group of artists as students of the Academy at the Chicago Fair seems to have been visible only through Camacho's case, at least in the documentation found so far. though their participation did echo one of the ideals represented by the women's building at the fair, that of women receiving higher education, that is, in the particular case of the arts, of academic training, this fact does not seem to have been particularly celebrated as an achievement of Mexican women in the context of their participation in the Chicago Columbine Exposition. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation très stimulante, par ailleurs magnifique, et pour avoir tenu le temps parfaitement. Donc merci. Voilà, je laisse la place aux questions.
This is a question for Ursula. One of the things that came up in the morning sessions was the different receptions of the women's exhibits at the fairs between their nations of origin versus the international audience that they are meeting. And so it seemed that when you were quoting from critics talking about the Mexican women painters, it was actually, were they American critics? Or?
No, most of them were Mexican. The one I quoted specifically about the paintings of the women artists, he was of Cuban origin, but he had lived in Mexico for a while. So he was like a Mexican, Latin American, I suppose, critic. But I haven't found yet criticism from the United States or from other nations. It's mostly Mexico's. I do still need to look at other archives and see if there's other information about the reception, in which I am very interested about, particularly in the case of Camacho's work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just struck. You mean even that quote that starts off with like, "Oh, these unpretentious, these modest works." That was a Mexican critic.
That's the Cuban critic.
It was a Cuban. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but it was common for critics to have a patronizing attitude towards the work of women. Mm. They would highlight the delicacy of their art and the subtlety and the emotions and things like. They would praise maybe their technical abilities, but yeah, they do tend to have a patronizing attitude towards women. And yes, the word unpretentious is not very complimentary.
I'm not sure what language to speak in, so it's the end of the day. I'll speak in English. Thank you for those two very stimulating papers, which, as one of the organizers, I recognize that there's a way in which it seems like the connections are not actually as obvious as perhaps other pairings, but at the same time, I think it's so interesting to think of your Mexican woman painter, who's not present at the fair, but who's present via her paintings, and who's challenging in the iconography that she's using representations of women, and then Anne's women, who are not at all challenging. I mean, who are not wanting theoretically to promote women, and who yet nonetheless by their presence. Organizing conferences are in fact claiming women's rights in civil space and arguing for a space. I mean, they're not arguing from the position of being women, but by their very presence are in fact showing that women are present. So that's my question for Anne then, is there any evidence of their, I mean, these exhibitions are moments for people coming from so many different horizons to get together. Is there any evidence of their attending the World Fair itself, of their going to the women's building, of their reflecting at all on this, or is it just impossible to see? They're in their organizations that's next to, and as a result, I mean, they're just pursuing their own agenda on this business of social science education.
Actually. Actually, that's a really good question, because the thing about Ana Lemperrier was that she was also a journalist, so she was part of the press corps at that And in fact, she also attended the women's, I think it was Œuvre et Institution Féminine, and she had a bit of a debate with some of the people over there. So she definitely was around, and she was making her way, at least to those particular events. And in fact, in reverse, Louise Dubord came to her conference. So they, so at least with the, she wasn't saying, okay, I'm not a woman, I'm not going to, she was, but she wanted to go in and sort of needle them too. That was, so I hope that answers.
I do have a question also for Anne. I'll ask it to both of you, although it's a little more difficult, I think, in the Mexican painter's case. For Anne, what do you think?
Yep.
Okay. What do you think accounts for the non-interest or disguised interest of your two women in some of the feminist projects of the time, and various legal reforms, equal work for equal pay, all these issues were on the table in very strong terms at those times. And yet they seem to be, if not standoffish, then simply not interested at all. How do you account for that?
Did you want to say anything?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm sure it's personal in the case of Anna Lampérière, but I'm not sure how. I think she had a series of experiences that could have made her into a feminist, that she was on her own. She could have wanted to demand more economic autonomy, but that was the thing she was least in favor of. So she also, it could have to do with her background in education, because one of the people that she worked with closely at some time, and I don't have evidence that they had a falling out, but they might have, is Pauline Kergomar, who had precisely the opposite approach to, obviously, to women in general. It's a difficult one, but I do suspect in her case it's personal. In Dick May's case, I suspect it might be a cultural issue, but I'm not sure. But she didn't. I just think she wasn't interested. She was politically always very independent. Like she had some good colleagues who were socialists, but I'm not convinced that she was a socialist. I think she always maintained kind of a distance from any kind of dogma of any kind, and maybe she considered it. She put it in that category. I don't know. She was a strange person.
So I have a question for each of you. So Ursula, I think the painting was just fantastic, and I think from what you said, it raises the question of what innovation is and who is permitted to assess innovation and to claim innovation. From what you said as well, apparently Mexican people in whatever avenues talked about Mexican things happening in Chicago. And I don't think it's specific to Mexico. I think it was a sort of trend that each nation was talking about their own exhibits to their own country, or what was going on, wherever was the exposition or exhibition. So would the fact that this happened in Chicago somewhere else modify or change the criteria from which innovation would have been assessed in Mexico on the same painting? So I know it's a very complicated question, but what I'm asking you is, was the fact that everybody was transported somewhere else, the painter, the painting, and those who were actually writing about the painting, could it make a difference with staying at home? So this is my question. Now, for Anne, this is a sort of, again, a sort of very open question. I like the delicate feminism that you mentioned. more generally speaking, I'm wondering about self-promotion. Now, when women or if women self-promote or promote themselves, and that they claim they're not feminists, I don't know if self-promotion is a way to say that they are not feminists, if you see what I mean. Yes. So, conversely, could you say that being a feminist means that you're always in the collective force or in collective drives? So I know it's a general question, but I'd like to remind people here that I was, when I was very young, I was struck with what Françoise Giroud said. She actually said that true equality between men and women would be reached when a mediocre woman would be granted responsibility. So I can't see, you see, I think it is the same sort of idea. Why is self-promotion a problem, if you want to look at it from a feminist point of view or from the point of view of history of women's emancipation? And of course, there are probably limits, but I'd like you to say a few words about this question of self-promotion. I'm aware this is more or less the same question as Karen, but it's worded differently.
Okay, is it the same question? Let me think about that. She self-promoted, but was very careful about seeming like she was self-promoting. I mean, of course, it's clear that she was self-promoting, right? But she, I think, there again, I think it might be her background, because for one thing, she didn't launch her literary career, and this is just a hypothesis, but until her dad died. So I think that there maybe had been a familial, well, maybe there was some kind of I don't know, gender thing going on in the family, that if you're a woman, you're not supposed to, go past a certain limit. And she didn't really believe. She believed, I think, judging. Well, here is, I don't know. Some people don't like to read fiction on a continuum with other things. But if you read her fictional production on a continuum with her other activities, she has written at least one thing that made me think that her idea of the woman's role was to promote men, to sort of be the woman behind the man. And and I think so. Whatever she did, that was going to be her limit. She wasn't ever going to be like, she didn't write anything theoretical, really. She did some little short stories and things, but she wrote plays, and she did write one play that was borderline feminist. It was about a single mother. But anyway, so I don't know if I've answered your question. I probably haven't. It's not quite there.
No, you have, but I mean, it's a very...
It's a difficult one, because
yeah.
She didn't talk about, that's her position on gender issues very much. It really wasn't even there, as a side, which is strange.
Yes. There was in the Mexican press attention given to what was happening about Mexico in Chicago, but there was also information about other countries as well. There was a lot of interest in Spain and in France as well. So it was not just attention given to Mexico. And I think also, like, regarding specifically the participation of women in the women's building, how it was accounted for in the press. It was really, I think, just a matter of describing and praising women, again, in this very patronizing way. But for example, all of these discussions about new womanhood and agency of women and women going out and working and rights of women, that was not at all discussed in the Mexican press. And I think there was also not a feminist agenda at all. I think, like, I cannot try to hint at in the paper this kind of like contradiction between how the press praised the abilities of the auxiliary of ladies to organize their participation of Mexico, and I did leave out a lot of things from how it was organized. But all in all, their agency was very restricted. So I think also the press kind of restricted the information that was of course reproduced in Mexico about what was actually going on in the women's building. And there's this silence also about Camacho's painting, like what would people think if they saw like a girl, a 17-year-old girl, like making a portrait of herself with a gun in her hand, right? But nobody says anything about that. It's just like it's the Huntress. It's called like the Huntress, and that's it. And then the work was shown again in 1898 in the 23rd exposition of the Academy, and it's the same thing. Like the work of Camacho was praised. She was already married at the time. In 98, she married, I think, in 93 or 92. She married earlier. But it's the same thing. She's praised as an artist, but she is not. Her work is not talked about. It's like there's just this strange silence. We don't want to talk about what she did, but they show it. The thing is that the interesting thing is that they show it again. And like I said, I still need to go to Chicago and do archive work there. I've just done archive work in Mexico. So I need to go to Chicago and see if there was any reviews of the press there and compare what was the reception in Mexico, what was the reception in the States, or see if I can find other accounts from other travelers about both the participation and the portrait itself.
I was totally entranced by the painting. Probably other people in the room were as well. Two questions about it. One, you had on the slide that it was in a private collection. I wanted to know if you know the fate of the painting. Have you seen the painting personally? Who owns the painting? You know, what happened to it? And then secondly, I may have missed this in your paper, and if I did, I'm sorry. I remember you mentioning that the blanket and the hat do not mean what they do post-1925, but what do they mean in 1893? What is it that people in 1893, when they saw this painting, she seemed to be in what looked like to me, a corset and a middle-class woman's dress with something that maybe betokens a more rural association, I guess, I would assume, of a blanket on top, and the hat certainly rural. So what do you make of the iconographic features of her self-presentation in this portrait?
Okay. Yes, first the Camacho married an Englishman by the name of Crabtree. I forgot his first name right now, but he was a businessman. And they did have one daughter, Enriqueta. I think she had other children, or was it her only children? I don't remember. Well, she had a daughter, Enriqueta, and she was a musician. And she married too. Enriqueta married, but she died very young. So her husband remarried to another woman. And Enriqueta, Carlota's daughter, and her husband had a son. And then Enriqueta's husband, who remarried, had 6 children. So there are 2 different family branches, branching down. There's a family that's like the direct descendants of Carlota Camacho, and then there's a family who's like the indirect descendants of Carlota Camacho. And the work is in possession of one of these descendants. So I haven't been able to find them. I'm still trying to. I have tried to contact several of them, but it is a difficult task. So I hope I'll be able to see the picture next year. Because, of course, this is the only image I have, which is, as you have seen, not very clear. I have the description of the article that was published in '93, and that's where I get the description of the hat, which is like the typical Jarano hat, which is from a stage in Mexico, which is Jalisco, and like the blanket that she's wearing is like a shawl that it's shaped like a blanket, and it is typical of different places of Mexico, but there definitely is a rural reference there also to hunting itself. And I'm still trying to analyze the iconography, the representation of this particular dress is a man's dress, actually. It's like the typical mariachi that everyone's seen. But it was not very popular in like the graphic art in Mexico. It does begin to be represented by the end of the 19th century, but very slightly. There were other representations of typical Mexicans that were much more iconic. Like the shawl that was iconic at the time was a shawl of a type of woman that was called the China, or China Poblana, which was this independent woman from lower classes who would be she would sell stuff, like have some sort of commerce, and she would wear like a shawl, but the shawl she's wearing is not that. It's.
Can I ask a follow-up? Is the shawl and a hat typically worn by men or typically worn by women?
By men. It is a very masculinist representation, yes.
But underneath, she's wearing a dress.
Yeah.
A woman's dress.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm still trying to analyze that in reference to the visual culture, her visual culture at the time. But it is an unusual representation, both of the Mexican type and a very masculinist representation or masculine representation of a woman.
Merci beaucoup pour ces questions et merci beaucoup à vous deux pour ces très stimulantes présentations de fin de journée qui a été longue mais extrêmement fructueuse.